Hey everybody, I've got something for you today that I hope you will find fun. I'm calling it "There's Always Another Awful Idea," and it was kind of a little short idea that I came up with based on a Mises article that came up recently. Let's take a quick look at it. It is a reprint last week of a speech from Lew Rockwell in June of 1998, entitled Mises and Liberty, and it is a nice long article, but there was one part of it that I saw as I was reading it that I thought was really fun and might be a good thing to riff on for a bit. So we've got this here. I'm just going to read this part out. I'll give you a little background. Basically, there's this Mont Pelerin Society, and Mises joined it, and a bunch of Milton Friedman's followers also joined it. And at one point, Mises stood up and shouted, "You're all a bunch of socialists," and stamped out of the Mont Pelerin Society. And everybody in the Chicago school thought this was very funny, but what really was going on was that there was a serious philosophical difference between Mises and the Chicago school that this occurrence and a lot of other ones actually underline and describe and kind of clarify. So the problem with the Chicago school is that they embraced a positivist methodology, which claims that all questions of theory and policy must be submitted to empirical testing. Basically, they're doing the same thing that Mises warned us about doing in Human Action, about trying to turn economics into a physical science. And the reason that you can't really do that is because people are not billiard balls, basically. People are infinitely more complex. So different people, or even the same person under slightly different circumstances, might react to the same stimulus with different results. They might, agree. They might disagree. They might disagree just out of spite. They might get angry. Things like that. There's a lot of differences with how people work compared to, or at least the depth of our understanding of how people work compared to the depth of our understanding of how billiard balls work, right? And so this positivist method works pretty well for natural phenomena, for billiard balls, for the orbits of stars. There's no will involved. There's no underlying mental processes that are happening that might cause something to change. Mars does not decide today to continue orbiting around the sun. The force of gravity and the conservation of angular momentum do that, and Mars does not have a will to decide spitefully to crash into the sun tomorrow, right? Unfortunately, this positivist methodology is very dangerous when applied to human things, such as economics or even politics, because what ends up happening is that you end up with a philosophy that requires everything that you try be submitted to empirical testing, and everything that hasn't been submitted to empirical testing may be tried. And that's the real clincher there. According to the Chicago School, according to positivists, we cannot know in advance whether a tight price ceiling will lead to shortages. We can only try it and observe the results. This application of positivism to economic theory and policy has been a bad development for liberty and for mankind in general because of what I'm going to get into in a minute. So, setting that all, so this is a long article, and I highly recommend that you go check it out and read it. I will have a link in the description for you so that you can go check it out. But I this part that I highlighted kind of put through a little bit of a, what would you call it, like a little inspiration into my head, and I kind of felt like, hey, let's look into this a little bit more deeply. And of course, Lew covers it a little bit more deeply in this article as well. So some of the stuff I'm going to say is going to be pretty similar to what he says in certain parts of the article, but hopefully I'm going to add a little bit of my own unique spin to it. So, here we go. The Austrian criticism of positivism is that there's no real way to perform a controlled economic experiment. That there's always a huge number of confounding factors in any experiment that you do. What can happen is that these confounding factors can cause things to go the wrong way according to theory, such as a minimum wage increase that coincides with an inflationary economy so that the effects of the minimum wage are minimized and in fact people are getting more employed. It would appear as though a price control has resulted in an increase in the supply of the good, which a good theorist using logical causal deduction would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, what's happening is that there's multiple things happening at once, and there's no real way to isolate these things. And so all you can really do is test and test again and test again. And if you get the wrong answer, well, let's test it again. There are things that can happen, such as subtle measurement errors. Like, for example, I saw an article a while back. I don't think I wasn't able to find it, but what it did was it looked at minimum wage effects, but it looked at restaurants that stayed open, that stayed in business, between the before and after periods. And so what actually happened was that there were a bunch of restaurants that went belly up, but all the other restaurants seemed to still continue to employ people the way that they did before. And that kind of thing can confuse results as well. So this is why the Austrian school focuses on an a priori logical causal theory, thinking about abstract things interacting, all else equal, thinking about logical connections, thinking about causality, this causes this, as opposed to just looking at aggregates of numerical data sets and saying, do these things correlate or not? This logical causal theory provides a framework. The framework is really important because, as Mises also said, you can have all the data in the world, but if you don't have some way to figure out how to interpret that data, you're going to end up either confused or all over the board because you won't have anything telling you, oh, I should look at X compared to Y, or I should look at Z compared to X, or I should look at this and not this because of this reasoning. This framework, that this kind of logical causal framework from say an Austrian style theory produces, allows you to sift through the data and say, well, I'm pretty sure that this should do this, but what actually happened? Well, I'm pretty sure that this will look like this, but what was the actual extent of the effect? It also can help you find these confounding factors because you can then examine, you can say, okay, this looks like this happened, and that shouldn't be that way, so let's look deeper and see what these confounding factors are and see if we can figure out what caused the strange, the unexpected result. And of course, people criticize this logical causal theory as saying that it's like made up from thin air and unfalsifiable, but in reality, you can find errors in logical causal arguments much easier than you can find it in an esoteric system of 150 equations. In that case, a single negative sign somewhere where it shouldn't be might destroy the whole thing. Whereas if someone makes a syllogism and you're like, well, that doesn't, the first 2 points don't lead to the second point in the syllogism, well, then now you have something you can go back and you can look at and you can try to determine the theory. But but the problem that people have is that a lot of the really basic conclusions of this logical causal theory don't let them don't suggest that they shouldn't do the things that they really would like to do. And so they're always trying to find ways to, but at the same time, they're very well reasoned out at this point and pretty solid, honestly. Like the Austrian perspective on price controls, things like that. So let's see. The positivist method is a little too enamored with esoteric statistical aggregates as well. When you have a bunch of data, you can play around with different correlations and different possibilities of correlations until you're blue in the face. And what usually happens if you play around with them enough, if you run it through a few thousand different statistical tests, odds are you will find some apparent correlations that get past the 95% confidence interval. And unlike a physics experiment where you really have to include everything that you tried under the conditions that you tried it, and you can't just say like, oh well, these 50 experiments, I think they didn't work right, and they gave me the wrong results, so I'm going to exclude those from my data, right? You can basically run these economic data through as many statistical tests as you want, and you find these correlations. And if you don't find any correlations, you can create new statistical tests. And the thing is that the number of tests that you come up with is eventually going to become so large that you're just going to get some apparent yeses just by random chance. For example, you can check the first derivative of variable x against the second derivative of variable y, or the the variable x itself versus the first derivative of variable y. Or you can compare their second derivatives. Or you can compare x at time t to y at time t minus 1, or t minus 2, or t minus 3, or t minus 4, or t plus 1, or t plus 2. There are all these different little variations in the statistical test that you could try, where if you try enough of them, you're eventually going to get something that looks statistically like it might be something. And this kind of, consistently causable error is something that you can basically make a career out of. And that can be a problem because what you'll do is you'll consistently demand certain policies that only work occasionally in your particular very niche statistical correlation system. I mean, there's a problem with this ubiquitous 95% confidence interval. The thing is that you might try dozens and dozens of different tests, and each of them will give you an independent approximation for its confidence interval, and eventually you're going to get false positives. Now what happens, and even if what happens is that you then run the test and discover that under the same correlation you get a negative result, you've still done this test twice and enacted a bad policy twice instead of once, or 0 times, if you actually used good theory to help you figure out what you're doing. The other thing that's kind of insidious about these statistical tests is that tests that give favorable results in the literature often get used in a lot of different ways. And if the problem with the test itself is somewhere deep in its reasoning, you can easily obscure that with enough mathematical jargon that it becomes very, very hard to figure out where the mistake is, as opposed to a logical argument which might be difficult to understand, but at least is written in plain English, and a person can say, well, I think that the reasoning here is specious, or something like that. Complicated mathematical tests, what they do in the end is they make results more obscure, harder to test, and more difficult for laymen to understand. For example, you can have linear combination models where you imagine an entity, say, that is 20% Ohio, 30% Michigan, 20% Indiana, and 30% Wisconsin. And then you look at that entity in using economic science, and you can come up with all kinds of really weird models like this, where you're not actually testing a thing. You're not actually testing something that actually happened. You're testing some kind of mathematical construction around things that happened. And what that can do is it can obscure emergent or unique issues that cannot appear. If you're using a model like this to look at the elasticity of demand of cherries as a function of time, you might discover that there's an emergent issue where when the supply of cherries goes below a certain amount, cherry farmers in Michigan particularly, or let's use one that isn't part of the model, right? Cherry farmers in Illinois, right, do X, which then increases the supply of cherries, but your imaginary model entity doesn't take that into account. So I kind of got off on this issue of statistical tests and how they can be deceptive, and how they can give you bad incentives on what you're trying to actually do to understand economics. It's like a numerical solution to a mathematical problem. You get the answer, and the answer might be self-consistent, or at least appear self-consistent, but just getting that numerical solution doesn't give you any intuition about how the problem is solved. Right? This is a problem that we have in physics, where you can take some kind of boundary conditions, some kind of differential equation, and you can come up with a solution, but it doesn't tell you where that solution came from. Whereas in physics, if you do something like an analytical proof or an analytical mathematical derivation that leads from point A to point B, then a physicist can look at that and say, "Oh, I see what's going on here. You're doing a Lagrange transform here. Then you're doing the reverse transform here. You've got an exponential here. You've got this here. Now I kind of understand what this system is doing in terms of like more basic functional building blocks, sines, cosines, Gaussians, Bessel functions, whatever they happen to be. Whereas if you just get the mathematical answer from the numerical solution, you don't get that intuition, and you end up saying, okay, I know this is the answer, but how do I get there? Often that's a bigger problem than just getting the answer. But setting this kind of statistical analysis or mathematical problem issue aside, the issue with positivism is that when you have a theory that demands positivist validation, you can always parse that theory more and more finely. For example, you might say, okay, price controls are bad for eggs. We all agree price controls are bad for eggs. But what about price controls for wool? What about price controls for light bulbs? What about price controls for, the center consoles of automobiles? The fact is that there's a practically unlimited number of stupid things that you can try. And every time you try them, you mess up the economy, and you damage real wealth, and you hurt real people. People aren't pawns that you move in a game. They have their own values, and for you to overrule them because you want to make sure that price controls are still bad for milk, you're wasting their time, you're wasting their energy, and you're wasting, their lives. Some fraction of stupid policies tried then there's the additional problem that some fraction of stupid policies that you try will be confounded by the economic complexity I was talking about earlier. And those policies will appear to work in that one case. In which case, well, we'll do more experiments along that same line. Maybe it works. Maybe price controls work for milk. Worked here. Well, no, there was a dairy boom that started from outside the state, and you didn't take any data from there, so there was an influx of... Things like that can happen. And what happens is that you do these policies and you make the same mistake twice or three times or maybe more. The other thing is that bad policies can be designed to hide or obscure their negative effects by spreading those effects out over time or into unmeasured or more hard-to-measure metrics. Imagine that your price controls on milk are somehow designed that the economic damage shows up in one breed of cow and not the other. Something weird like that. Something strange, right? Or that it shows up in the amount of milk per cow, but not in the gross amount of milk because there's a net influx of cows. Something like that. And in fact, from the positivist perspective, you can try all of these bad policies with minuscule little differences in them. You can say, okay, well, we'll try a price control of milk at $3 a gallon. Okay, $3.10, $3.20, $3.15, $3.25. You get some auctioneer up there. It's like $3.40, $3.60, and you're just trying a stupid thing over and over again with a different number. That at some point the number's not going to affect anything because it's going to be way above the market price. But we already knew that if we had our good, logical, causal framework. We know that price controls cause shortages, price ceilings cause shortages unless the ceiling is far enough above the market price that marginal units are not affected by it, right? So, if you just said, oh well, that's our theory and it seems pretty, and let's assume that it's logically airtight, then you say, oh well, then we shouldn't try price controls on milk. That's dumb. You'd save time, you'd save money, you'd save wealth, and you'd save a lot of wasted efforts on people. Policies, there's another example of this where, like, you have the not real socialism, where, oh, well, we tried state ownership of industry, and that didn't work. But what about state control, but without ownership of property? Well, no, that didn't work, okay. Well, what if we do, like, state ownership just of the land and the highest order producers' goods only? Oh, that didn't work. Oh, what if we try, state ownership of the food industry, but not the shoe industry? And you end up making all of these, an unlimited number of really bad tests that just enrich the cronies and make the rest of the people poorer. The other thing is that a lot of the time it can be really hard to figure out the time effects of such a policy, right? In a complex economy, there are these roundabout processes that take years and years and years. the point from the groundbreaking of a new factory to the point that factory starts actually making cars, or to the point where that factory starts making cars at the peak rate that it's going to make cars until it collapses, kind of thing. And so you can easily obscure the results of policy by claiming that certain things happened too far apart. Or, even worse, you can do things like do things that separate and obscure hard numerical effects. A good example of this is what happens when the government spends in the economy. Well, GDP goes up, 1-to-1 with government spending, G, right? And when the government prints money in order to spend it, that money inflates the money supply and causes prices to increase. But those price increases don't happen immediately. They happen significantly. They can happen pretty significantly after the actual spending. And so you end up with something that looks like a real GDP increase, because in quarter one the government spent $1 trillion. In quarter two the government spent another $1 trillion, but the prices went up in quarter two. And so the GDP goes up in quarter one, and it goes down a little bit in quarter two, but not significantly. The conclusion that I'm trying to bring you all to is that you really do want these logical causal methods that the Austrian school uses to avoid this kind of perpetual destructive fiddling with policy. You want people to understand that, hey, if I do a price ceiling on this good, what we're going to see are shortages, and it doesn't matter how many experiments you do. Yeah, you're going to either have shortages or you're not. And the cases where you're not, the reason that you don't is because the price ceiling is set above a relevant market value. And the thing is that positivism also leads you kind of down this primrose path where you're surrounded by these control freaks, and these control freaks always have something else they want to try, no matter how absurd it is. And the reason that they do this is because usually these plans are designed to enrich the control freaks a little bit at the expense of everybody else. And of course, that would be something that we'd like to avoid, because these are just shysters, and they shouldn't really get to enjoy the benefits from the absurd, nonsensical, idiotic policies that they promote, but they often do. Welcome to government. So yeah, that's kind of all I've got. I just kind of wanted to get into this because you have to remember that if you demand that all ideas in economics, in a human-centered science like economics, be empirically tested, and you throw away the possibility of having a logical framework with which to determine kind of the base effect of these things, you end up with problems with complexity, you end up with problems with confidence factors leading you in the wrong direction, you end up with an infinite number of really bad ideas to try, and you end up with people trying these infinite number of bad ideas because it makes them a little bit richer every time they try it, and they face no consequences, welcome to government, when they fail. So that's all I have for today. I hope that this was a little bit enlightening. Again, check the description for the link to the Lew Rockwell, speech transcript, and give it a read because it's good stuff. And yeah, thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all next time.